All right. Well, welcome everybody. We're so glad you could be with us this evening. Thank you for setting aside some time in what we know are your very busy schedules to join us. Tonight, our topic is around COVID-19 again, which is what a lot of us are living day in and day out and thinking about a lot. But we're going to be talking tonight about COVID-19 vaccines, kind of where things stand in the development of those, and particular look at what that means for the DEE population, and considerations that we need to keep in mind as we're thinking about whether to vaccinate our families, our children with DEEs, and those around us. So again, thanks for joining us. We're really excited about this conversation. This conversation was planned in conjunction with NINDS, the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. We have two folks from NINDS, Dr. Adam Hartman and Dr. Ravi Nath, and we have Dr. Jim Campbell from the University of Maryland School of Medicine, and we have Jennifer Holland, who has a daughter with PCDH19. Before we jump into the meat of things, I just want to share a few things, which is that we are recording this session, just so you're aware, and it will be available in about 2 days online. If you have questions throughout, please put them into the Q&A box that shows up in the bar. We'll be saving most questions for the end of the presentation, unless there are clarification questions, excuse me. I'll jump in with those as they come up. All participants who are not panelists will be muted and are not on video throughout. So if you do have anything to say, please use the chat box for just comments, and then the Q&A box for questions, as that's where we'll look for them when the time comes. Just a quick disclaimer that we have, a number of really talented doctors on with us, but there is no substitute for talking about your child's specific case with the providers who know your child the best. So throughout, we'll be talking about some guidance and some, thoughts around COVID-19, but really the best way to get answers about your child is to chat with your child's provider, epileptologist, neurologist, pediatrician. With that, I'm going to go ahead and move on and welcome our caregiver voice, who today is Jennifer Holland. She is mother to Sloan, who lives with PCDH19, and she'll tell us a little bit about her experiences and thoughts on COVID vaccines. So Jennifer, on to you.
Hi, I am Jennifer Holland. I am the mother of two children. One is a 9-year-old boy named Brooks, and my daughter is 7 years old named Sloan. We have been on the PCDH19 roller coaster since she was 7 months old. That's when her first cluster was. Sloan is fully vaccinated. She, including the flu shot every year, she has always done very well with vaccines, except for her kindergarten MMR shot. I am thankful in retrospect that we did get it, but that shot, being a live virus within it, is, I assume, the reason she wound up hospitalized twice within a week, because of the prolonged inflammation in her body that she was trying to fight off. Moving forward with the COVID-19, we locked down for the first few months. We're in Arkansas. Arkansas is not as densely populated as it is in the Northeast and the Florida coast, with the beaches opening back up. And so we haven't had the spread that other areas have had. It is starting to pick up a little bit more because our economy is opening back up. People are out and about, living their lives. We've made the decision in terms of what we're going to do as a family. We're kind of choosing to put our kids into outdoor activities. They love baseball and softball. We are not choosing to take them into restaurants, indoor activities. My daughter wants to go back to gymnastics, and I have told her no, and I can't tell her when we'll go back. In terms of the vaccine that is coming out, my son, my husband, and I will get that vaccine. In terms of whether or not Sloan will, I'm really looking for guidance from the doctors and from her epileptologist as well about what they think of that vaccine for her. The only reason I'm hesitant is because of how she reacted to that last MMR, which she didn't react negatively to it the first go round, but that second go round really caused her some problems. And so I'm looking to make the most educated decision that I can for Sloan. PCDH19 is like any other of these diseases that our children are living with. Our kids are so different. Within PCDH19, there is such a huge spectrum in terms of cognitive abilities and seizure control, and just, you know, it just has the whole range. And so I know that what I choose to do for my daughter with PCDH19 may not be what others choose to do for theirs, because we don't even have a medicine that works well for all of our girls. So I know that we can't all respond in the same way in terms of treatment. But I am looking forward to hearing what the doctors have to say, and I just want to move forth and be able to take back to my community as much data as I can, so that parents can make the most educated decision that they can, because COVID-19 is, thinking about our children being diagnosed with COVID-19 is a scary thing. I can't even imagine what that might look like in my daughter. And so I'm just looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say, and I appreciate you all having me on here.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Yeah, and I think I've been talking with a lot of families, DE families, about their thinking and how they're feeling about all of this, and also with a number of, you know, providers who do caregiving for DE children. And you know, for our family, we've been in lockdown since very, very early in this, and basically, you know, are living very near total isolation. And I think for us, because, you know, my child, Elliot, he's got severe respiratory challenges, severe hypotonia. He's the kind of kid that if he used to get pneumonias all the time, and they've nearly killed him a number of times. So for us, we know that this is something that we don't want anywhere near our house. So we are on ultra lockdown. And I don't really see that changing until there's a vaccine that really, you know, can address this, and we can find some herd immunity out there. So it could be a very long time, you know. And I think, you know, you bring up a really great point, Jennifer, about kind of having some fears around some kind, you know, around some vaccine related issues. And I think, you know, I think luckily we've not seen a lot of COVID in children with DEEs. And I think, you know, one of the reasons is that because our families know how to keep infection at bay, right? We know how to shelter in place. We've done that a lot. But, you know, I think it's really important for families to recognize the value of vaccines and how critical they are to saving lives. And like you said, I think our family is likely to get the vaccine, but hold off on getting it for Elliot for a while until we have a better sense of how it affects those people who are really at high risk. And, you know, so I think there's a lot of things to consider here, a lot of considerations to keep in mind, and I'll pass it on to our experts now, because they have a lot more educated things to say than I do. So our moderator today is going to be Dr. Adam Hartman. He's a program director at the National Institutes of Health in NINDS, and which is the, for those of you who don't know, it is the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke at the NIH. And he's not just a program director, he's always also, a practicing pediatric neurologist. So Adam, I'll let you take it away and share with us your thoughts and take us into our conversation.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you and with your guests tonight. And the panelists. This is, I think, you're in for a treat listening to both Dr. Jim Campbell and Dr. Ravi Nath, who we're going to introduce in a few minutes. You know, the decisions that you're facing and some of the challenges that you're facing are very real. And these are things that we hear. And I know my own patients have asked me similar questions. We talk a lot about what to do if the child does start having clusters of seizures. You know, I find myself being a little more conservative these days in terms of rescue medicines than I have been under other circumstances. You know, the families are doing a fantastic job of you know, physical distancing, but it's a real challenge, and it's taking a real toll on the children. It's taking a toll on their families, on their siblings, and on their parents. So this is very real. And so I think we're going to have an interesting discussion this evening. Our first panelist tonight is Dr. James Campbell, who received his undergraduate degree from Georgetown University. He received his medical degree from Columbia University in New York City, and a master's in epidemiology and biostatistics from the University of Maryland School of Medicine. He completed his pediatrics residency at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, and then was a practicing pediatrician in the Navy, both on Guam and in Bethesda. He then completed a fellowship in pediatric infectious diseases at the University of Maryland and has been a faculty member there since 2001. From 2007 to 2012, he lived in Uganda, where he worked for the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, mainly in the field of HIV prevention and care. He's also the senior vice chair of the Institutional Review Board and is director of the University of Maryland, Baltimore Clinical Research Training and Mentoring Program. He currently combines clinical care, research, and teaching at the University of Maryland. He's involved in a large portfolio of research endeavors, including testing vaccines for influenza, anthrax, meningococcus, cytomegalovirus, and respiratory syncytial virus. He's a member of the Committee on Infectious Diseases of the American Academy of Pediatrics and is also the lead for the maternal child clinical trial section of the Center for Vaccine Development. Since the emergence of COVID-19, he has assisted the Maryland chapter of the AAP with COVID-19 related policies. He's provided input to members of Governor Hogan's State of Maryland COVID-19 task force and has investigated remdesivir and baricitinib in randomized clinical trials, and has also reviewed national pediatric policy on COVID-19 care of neonates born to women with COVID-19, and has started and provided daily updates to a web page on kids and COVID-19 designed for providers and families. And he's also provided many interviews to the media, particularly related to COVID-19 and children and to vaccine development. Dr. Campbell.
Thanks, Dr. Hartman, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you all. That was a long introduction. Just a quick overview. So yeah, I am a pediatrician. I still, even despite all those other things, I see patients frequently. I'm a pediatric infectious disease specialist, and that's what I enjoy the most. I am on all of those committees and help to make some of those policy decisions. One of the things that I'm doing right now, and I think that you all can help as I'm thinking through, as we're moving forward in designing vaccine trials, is, as you probably know, there are currently early phase trials going on in adults, and we want to be prepared to do vaccine trials, meaning testing the same vaccines in children once we think it's safe and reasonable to start in children. So I'm one of the chairs for the NIH on developing those protocols. Like, who do we include in the protocols? How do we evaluate the safety of children? What's the appropriate numbers of children that we test? What's the tripwire essentially to decide, okay, there's enough safety and there's enough information in adults that we feel like now is the time to move to kids. And then once we have the early trials in children, then when do we start moving out to children who are not healthy? Like, when do we move to kids who have other problems? So we're struggling with all of that now, and I'll go through a little bit of that with you. I have a few PowerPoint slides that are just sort of a way that I can describe to you a little bit about what COVID is and sort of set the basis so that if you have questions for me, you'll understand where we're coming from. So let me just open this up. All right. So just 2 days ago, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has updated their epidemiology, meaning how many cases there are, how many deaths there are, et cetera. So this is one of the figures from that table, from that paper. And you can see on the top are cases in the United States. These are confirmed cases, meaning that they have a test done to prove that they have COVID-19. And in the bottom panel, those are the numbers of deaths. And you can see the sort of the shape of the curves looks very similar. And, I think we're all kind of excited that the numbers are going down, both for cases and deaths, but we would be more excited if they're going down a lot more quickly. What I have here over on the right is a little editorial. They're saying June 1st, the end of this period that was reported, you're at about 20 or 25,000 cases per day reported in the United States. So yes, it's going down from the peak when we were at 35,000, but you're about the same level when we were on the rise as the first week of April when people were very scared. So good news is we are going down. Bad news is it's not your typical like bell-shaped curve. It's very slowly moving down. And in some places, as you've probably heard in the news, more cases, so it's going up. And same with deaths, of course, it's very encouraging that there are fewer and fewer deaths, but at the peak, here, if you look on April 21st or so, the peak, you're talking about 3,000 people every day dying in the United States. It's way down, but it's still at 1,000 people every day dying. So we're still in the middle of the tail end of, if you will, the first wave. I mean, nobody knows whether or not there's going to be multiple waves, but we're not, this isn't over yet. This is a pictorial of how the disease works in terms of symptoms and when you can make the diagnosis and by what means. So if you look over on the left in the gray area, it says before symptom onset, and then the vertical dashed line is when you start having symptoms. So from the time you're exposed until you have symptoms, we call that the incubation period, and that can be up to about 2 weeks. And in the first week after exposure, even though you might be infected, usually most of the diagnostic tests can't pick up the virus. But then even in the week prior, so no symptoms yet, but you're already infected, the diagnostic tests then can start to pick it up. But you'll see the peak, if you look where the blue and the pink and the red curves are, the peak of the time when we can pick up by our diagnostic tests that you're infected is there right around the time of symptom onset and in that first week. The main way that the diagnosis is made is what we call PCR. So it stands for polymerase chain reaction. It's just a fancy way of saying looking for the genetic material of the virus. So the virus has like a fingerprint of its genetic material, and we can do tests where you do a swab in the nose or a swab in the throat, and then various different platforms, different assays can tell you whether or not that genetic material is there. So it peaks there in the first week, and then it slowly comes down over time. The dotted lines, both the purple and the green dotted lines, you can see those don't start going up until typically in the second week. Those are the antibodies. So after you're infected, your body's immune system will make antibodies, and that's a way of saying, did you ever have the infection or did you recently have the infection? There's different types of antibodies. The purple one we call IgM, the green one IgG. G tends to last a long time, M tends to go away pretty quickly. One of the encouraging things is this red line, which you can see goes up with the PCR and but then comes back down pretty quickly. What that is viral culture. So that's where you try to look for live virus that you can actually find that it would be transmissible, meaning like it can grow in the laboratory. It's not just the genetic footprint of it. And no one's been able to grow virus after about the second week of illness, even though the PCRs, the genetic material, is still found positive. Sometimes I had a mom who was sick and then she delivered a baby. Thank God the baby was not infected, but she, her husband, and their 2-year-old were all infected. She was still PCR positive 60 days after. She was very sick and critically ill. She's well now, but even 60 days later, she was PCR positive, but presumably her cultures were negative at that point. So the baby was briefly separated from the mom, but then we let the baby go back to mom. Anyway, it's good news that it's unlikely that PCR positivity, even though that lasts long, that may not reflect how long you can transmit the virus to another person. You know, we talk about this thing called pathophysiology, which kind of means like how the body responds in abnormal ways to infections or other diseases. And this is what most people now, this kind of cartoon tells you what a lot of doctors think is going on with COVID-19. That is, early in the illness, that triangle to the left says viral response phase. That's where we're making sort of the usual response you might make like to a regular upper respiratory virus or the flu or whatever, where the virus causes some problems like fever or muscle aches or, you know, some runny nose or cough or whatever. But then it resolves after that with most respiratory infections. And for most children, that's the only thing that happens to them. They either asymptomatic, you know, no symptoms and it just goes away, or they have mild symptoms and their body just responds in a normal way. They get rid of the virus and they do well. For people who get sick, which is very rare in children, but happens in young adults and especially in older adults or adults with what we call comorbidities or other diseases, they then have a pulmonary phase. So it gets down into their lungs and they get essentially a type of pneumonia that we call ARDS. So it can be severe, it can be mild, but sometimes gets quite severe. And many of them, the ones who get especially ill, they have this in the kind of orange color there to the right, what we call an exaggerated inflammatory response. So inflammation is a type of immune response that typically is good. You know, you don't like it if you have inflammation, right? If you have like a little infection on your skin, or if you have an allergic reaction, or if you have asthma or something, all of that is a type of inflammation. It's your body's immune system reacting to things. And usually there's like a check and balance where there's a little bit of inflammation, but then your body kind of reacts back to prevent it from kind of going out of whack. What's happening with COVID, for some reason, for some people, is when they get later on in the course, like the second, third week of illness, they have this overwhelming inflammatory response, what we call cytokine storm. So all of these proteins that your immune system usually puts little bits of them out, putting huge amounts of it out. So high fevers, lots of fluids all over their body, aches, and then, you know, respiratory distress, and eventually some of them then needing to be like on a mechanical ventilation and getting very sick and critically ill. So when we're looking at how we can treat people, children and adults, we think about like, how can we try to attack the virus? And also, how can we try to dampen, like hold off, like slow down the immune response if you get into those late phases? And a lot of the studies that have been done, including ones that we're doing now, try to target those things: viral, cutting down on the virus, and also dampening the immune response at the right time. This comes from an article in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which I thought is a nice pictorial on sort of how the virus moves through the cells and then where the drugs and the interventions we're using are trying to target based on that viral life cycle. So if you can see in the upper left there where it says SARS-CoV-2, it's called a coronavirus, the CoV part, because a corona means crown in Latin. And if you look at it on a certain way of imaging, it looks like it has a crown, like a halo around it. And the reason it looks like that is because it has all these projections on the outside of the virus called spike protein. And when you look at it on the side, it looks like a halo or a crown. Those projections, the spike protein, they attach to something called ACE or ACE2. And it's a protein that sticks out on many of the cells in our body. So in lung cells, in cells in your nose, your kidney, your heart, and on the lining of your blood vessels. And that protein has a very important role in normal physiology, human physiology, that has to do with blood pressure control. But for some reason, you know, sometimes we anthropomorphize, meaning we make these viruses seem like they're sort of human. We think, okay, the virus figured out, find a receptor, find a thing that sticks out on the outside of a human cell and stick to it. And that's what it's done. It sticks very well to ACE2. And this is a picture of a cell in the lungs, the alveolus, which is the very bottom of the lungs where the air exchange occurs. So it sticks to that, and then it gets pulled inside of the cell because of that ACE2 receptor. And then it lets out its genetic material, which is there like that blue curly squiggly line in the center. It's RNA, which is a type of genetic material. It lets it out into the inside of your cell, and then essentially it turns your cells into factories. The cells become factories to just make more and more virus. So viruses are really like parasites, take over the cellular machinery just for the purpose of making more and more cells. But we kind of know how viruses work, so we can attack in the upper left how it attaches to our cells, how it releases its mRNA, how it chops the little proteins that it makes up. It has to chop them up into smaller proteins. Those are called proteases, so we can attack those. It also, the genetic material has to make more genetic material. Those are called polymerases. That, you've probably heard about remdesivir. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. That trial recently showed that remdesivir worked, and that prevents the virus from making more virus, from making more genetic material. It's similar to things like, you've probably heard about Valtrex for herpes or acyclovir for chickenpox. It's a similar type drug to those. And then if you look on the very top here, there's a picture of a macrophage. That's one of your own white blood cells. That thing swallows up viruses and then puts on its surface little pieces of the virus, and it lets all the rest of the immune system know what you're being infected with, what we call antigen presentation. And once that happens, it starts sending out these cytokines like you see this interleukin 6, IL-6, but there's also IL-1 beta and many, many other cytokines. And so there's lots of things being used to try to attack or dampen those. One that we're studying right now is called baricitinib. It is currently licensed. It's an oral medication. It's licensed for adults who have rheumatoid arthritis, and it's been very well tolerated and works quite well for them. Sometimes it's used in kids who have inflammatory diseases, like the sort of like rheumatoid arthritis that children get, and other inflammatory problems. And you may have heard in the news yesterday that the United Kingdom found that dexamethasone, which is a type of steroid, which sort of dampens across all the immune system, worked to decrease mortality among adults who were very sick with COVID. So all of that is not working on the virus, it's working on the immune system to dampen the immune system response. So anyway, that gives you like a kind of an overview of the way that scientists or people who are trying to design trials think about what the life cycle is and where we can attack the life cycle in terms of drugs and other things that we might have at our disposal. So we've been involved in a number of trials. One is this one called ACT, or the Adaptive COVID-19 Treatment Trial. It's at all of those sites all over the world. And the first part of the trial, we showed that remdesivir, I'll show you in the next picture here, this was the report that we put out showing that remdesivir, this antiviral drug, decreased the amount of time it took for people to recover. So if you were not on remdesivir, 15 days was the amount of time it took to recover. If you were on remdesivir, 11 days. There was also lower mortality, as you can see there. 54 people died who got placebo, 32 died, that's the very bottom row there, who got remdesivir. Now, we do a lot of fancy math on this, and you have to kind of show that it's what we call statistically significant. You can't mathematically show with these smaller numbers that 54 is mathematically different than 32. But just last Friday, we closed the whole over 1,000 people who, this was a preliminary report. We'll now have in about 2 weeks the final report on this, and we'll be able to show whether or not there truly was a difference in mortality. Has it been studied in kids? It's been given to kids, but it has not yet, there's not enough kids actually, which is good news, infected with this for us to be able to have these large trials, but it has been given, including at our institution and lots of others, under what we call emergency use authorization from the FDA. So on to vaccines. We and others have been testing a number of different vaccines. Vaccines come in different flavors, if you will, and you probably know this from vaccines that your children have gotten. So some of the vaccines are either the whole virus or pieces of the virus. They can be inactivated, meaning killed, or weakened, meaning things like MMR, those are all, or the chickenpox vaccine, those are weakened viral vaccines. We also have what we call viral vectors. That means you take a different virus and you put the gene from COVID inside of that virus, and you have that other virus express, meaning make proteins that are COVID related. So there are companies making things related to things like adenoviruses, which are different respiratory viruses, or measles virus, or other types of animal viruses that can vector or sort of be like a Trojan horse to bring the COVID antigen, meaning like the thing that leads to the immune response to people. Then there are nucleic acid viruses. This is where we take the genetic material from the virus of interest that you want to make the vaccine and directly inject that into people. And you've probably heard about the Moderna. That was the first one that have released their results, and they showed that there is safety, that it seems to be safe in the few people that have gotten it so far, and that the immune responses look similar to those who have been infected, who have recovered from infection. So if recovery from an infection leads to protection, then it's likely that the RNA virus that Moderna made will also lead to protection. Now, the good thing about those vaccines, they can be produced very quickly and in large scale, essentially right away, because it's the manufacturing part is easy. The quote bad thing about that virus is we currently have no licensed vaccines anywhere for adults or kids that are RNA-based viruses. There's a lot that have been in testing, but we don't have any yet licensed. So, I mean, it would be awesome from our point of view if this is our ability to figure out that RNA viruses work and it's COVID, that's the first one. But, you know, people have put a lot more stead in the safety and the predictability of vaccines when they're of what we call a platform that's been used before, that we have a lot of experience with. And those are things like, so that last group there, the protein-based. So if your children or you have had hepatitis B virus vaccine, that's a protein-based vaccine. If you've had HPV, the human papillomavirus vaccine, that's a virus-like particle. So it's like a ghost. It has no DNA or RNA, and it's just a shell of the outside. Every single one of those types, these make up all the types of vaccines that we have in our portfolio that are licensed. Every one of them is under evaluation right now. And you can see the huge numbers, some of them very early, these exploratory types are over to the left, and then some in phase 1s, and one now, maybe 2 as of this week, are in what we call phase 2 trials. And I'll go through that a little bit in a second. So how do the RNA virus vaccines work? You take just a piece of the virus, the genetic material of the virus, and in this case, those spike proteins that I showed you in the picture of coronavirus, you take the RNA that makes the spike and none of the other rest of the genetic material of the COVID, and you inject that directly inside of this, what we call lipid nanoparticle. So it's just like a coating so that it can get inside the cells. And then your cell makes some of the proteins from COVID, puts it on the outside of the cells, and your body thinks kind of that you're infected. You don't get the symptoms of infection, but your immune system acts as if you were infected and hopefully makes an immune response that will protect you in the future. The vectored ones I explained to you already, where you take a different virus. The ones that are under study right now, I'll explain them to you on a figure in just a second. And then protein-based, one of the companies has, similar to like a hepatitis B vaccine, where you just have pure, hepatitis B is just what we call pure antigen from the surface of hepatitis B virus. This would be pure antigen of spike. You just make like a factory of making just the spike protein. These are the current vaccines. I showed you like there are about 100 of them in development, but these are the ones that are furthest along and will likely reach phase 3. Phase 3 trials in our world means where you test efficacy. That means you're not just testing, are they safe? Do you make an immune response? You're testing, do they actually protect you against the virus? So Moderna, they've already done a phase 1 trial, and it was part of our consortium, not at our site, but our consortium that did that phase 1 trial. We are gearing up right now at Maryland and many other sites to do the phase 3 trial. The phase 2 has just started. There are going to be 30,000 people. These are all adults. And it's starting in about, it says there July 15th, but it may start as early as the first week of July if everybody can get all the pieces together. We're gearing up for it right now at Maryland and many others. We expect to enroll about 500 people, and most of the sites somewhere between 250 and 1,000 people at each site. So lots of sites across the United States and some outside. AstraZeneca is another company that makes vaccines. They took up a vaccine that was developed at Oxford University in the UK. That is a chimpanzee adenovirus. So it's a respiratory virus that causes infection in chimps, but they make it very weakened. So humans don't really react to it so much, but you put the gene of the spike protein into it. And they've already vaccinated in the UK over 1,000 people, including teenagers. And they only have to give 1 dose, as you see there. And it looks like, again, safe so far and making an immune response. We yet do not know whether those immune responses are going to be protective, but at least we're seeing the responses we would like. Both of those first two also have some animal studies that look very encouraging, where people have given these to animals and then purposefully tried to infect those animals, and they look like they were protected. So those data are still preliminary, but so far things are looking very encouraging for the doses of Moderna's and AstraZeneca's. Johnson & Johnson, together with Janssen, which is their partner in Europe, have a human adenovirus that's similar vaccine to the AstraZeneca. We don't yet know when that one will start. It's a little bit behind, but probably also in the summertime. Sanofi Pasteur is another company that makes lots of vaccines and drugs in the US and elsewhere. They have a recombinant, what we call R spike, meaning recombinant, just pure spike protein, plus an adjuvant. That means something you put in the vaccine that helps to boost your immune response. That is getting closer. Probably in the fall, they would be able to start their studies. And then Merck, another big company, has 2 that have not yet gotten that far along. But what I'm getting at here is our hope is that we don't have a single winner. It's not like a competition where one wins. We're hoping there will be multiple vaccines available over time. Why is that? Because if the whole globe wants to be vaccinated, and presumably nearly the whole globe will, that's 8 billion people. There is no company with any vaccine that can make 8 billion doses of a vaccine in the time period we want. You need multiple companies, multiple places, and multiple products. That it might be one product is better for one group of people and another product for another. I'm just going to end with a couple of things on regular old immunizations. The scary thing that's happened during the COVID pandemic is that because of people not seeking healthcare, or because healthcare providers have asked people not to come in except for urgent problems, the rate of routine immunizations has gone down in the United States drastically. This is from the CDC, showing that both for all non-influenza doses, which is the solid line, and for doses of vaccine that have measles in them, which pretty much means MMR, as you can see, just fell off in a huge way after March 13th. Millions of children who would normally have gotten MMR did not get it in March and April. We've been looking at this in Maryland, and it's just as scary in Maryland. If you look all the way over to the left here, you can see if you compare 2019, which is the first bar in blue, to 2020, it's 12,000 versus 7,000. And then if you look in April, it's 15,000 versus 4,000. So we have about 17,000 kids in March and April who did not receive measles vaccine that would have if we didn't have the COVID pandemic. If we open up our world and people start traveling and people start, being in contact with each other, and one case of measles occurs, there's going to be a big epidemic among children within our pandemic. So we're working very hard with our state and with the AAP and with everybody to try to make sure that as we're reopening, one of the big parts of that plan is that everybody gets caught up again in their routine immunizations. 71% reduction in MMR in the state of Maryland. MISC is the new name for this disease that kids are getting after they're infected. You may have heard about it. Some people are calling it Kawasaki-like disease. So they had a mild, most of them had a mild or even unrecognizable infection about a month or 6 weeks before. And then for what we still don't know why, they then developed this syndrome of high fever, severe abdominal pain, other gastrointestinal problems like diarrhea, some with a rash, red eyes, and red lips. Some have gotten very sick from cardiac problems. And we're still studying this, and it tends to happen in places where the epidemic curve is on the down. In other words, New York had huge numbers of cases until a few weeks ago, and now we just had a conference call with them, and they're seeing very little now because they're so far out from the peak of their epidemic. But it's another thing that we've been thinking about in developing vaccines is to make sure that the vaccine itself does not lead to this problem. Because if your immune response to the infection leads to this problem, could it be that the immune response to a vaccine would lead to this? So we're going to be following that really closely. So I hope that was helpful in terms of telling you where we stand with vaccines and what our plans are for developing them. This is a picture of Davidge Hall, which is it's the oldest continuous use medical teaching facility in the United States, and it's right on my campus where we work in Baltimore. So I'll end there, and thank you all for having me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and the questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Campbell. We have some questions, but we're first going to hear from Dr. Ravi Nath, who is the clinical director of the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. He's also the chief of the section of neurological infections. Previously, he was a professor and director of the Division of Neuroimmunology and Neurological Infections in the Department of Neurology at Johns Hopkins University. His research is focused on the clinical manifestations, pathophysiology, and treatment of emerging neurological infections with a focus on HIV infection. In recent years, he has studied the neurological complications of endogenous retroviruses, Ebola, Zika virus, and the virus we're talking about today, SARS-CoV-2. He received the Pioneer Award from the International Society of Neurovirology. He also received the Webran Award from the Society for Neuroimmune Pharmacology, a mentorship award from NINDS, and the Director's Award from NIH and the Health and Human Services Award. He's also the past president of the International Society of Neurovirology. Dr. Nath.
Oh, thanks, Ellen, for that very kind introduction. And I really enjoyed your presentation, Dr. Campbell. It was really tour de force for all the entire vaccine development, the complications in children, very informative. So what I will do is, in the next few minutes, just tell you what we understand about the effects of the virus on the nervous system. So the first thing I want to reassure you is that this virus is not as neurotropic as a lot of other viruses are. So its ability to penetrate into the brain is not as much as, for example, West Nile encephalitis virus you may have heard of, or rabies or herpes viruses. These things really seek out the brain. While the SARS-CoV-2 enters the lungs, and from there it can spread to other systems, but predominantly affects the lungs. And so the brain then is a bystander of sorts. So usually the effects on the brain are due to the fact that the lungs are affected, or sometimes the kidneys are affected, and the metabolism is affected in various ways. So and then the brain secondarily gets involved. Having said that, the virus does cause fever, and it does cause changes in the acid-base balance, the oxygen levels, and such, especially in severe cases. And it causes immune abnormalities, just as Dr. Campbell described. And those things in turn can decrease one's seizures threshold. So a child who already has seizures, their seizure threshold can decrease. And so they would be more likely to develop seizures. And therein, somebody was asking about rescue medications, and Dr. Hartman will probably address that further, is what people would typically use in order to treat these breakthrough seizures. So having said that, it does have some neurological manifestations. One of them is loss of smell. Okay, and so loss of smell occurs quite frequently with a lot of respiratory viruses, but for some reason with this virus, it seems to be much more than what we understand about other viruses. And the more you look for it, the more you find. So in the literature, people describe 30%, 50%, and some people claim that, well, if you actually go and test people who have it, you might find as much as 90% of individuals might have loss of smell. And the concern was that in some animal models, sometimes if you put these types of coronaviruses, which are different kinds of coronavirus, not the one that causes COVID-19, you put it into the nasal passages, it can enter the brain, and it goes up the nerves that supply your nasal mucosa and are responsible for smell. And through that, it can actually enter the brain and go into the brainstem. However, all the pathology so far suggests that that's not the case with this virus. It doesn't directly affect the nerve. It affects the cells that are around the nerve. So it can cause damage to the nerve by doing so, and hence the loss of smell. But there's no evidence to suggest that that leads to entry of the virus into the brain. But loss of smell is still an important symptom because children and adults might not even some may complain that yes, they can't smell well. Others might say food doesn't taste very well. And so they can lose their appetite. They may not eat properly. And so it's important to be on the lookout because calorie rehydration, and proper hydration is important. And nutrition should be provided to children even if they have any kind of infection with this virus. The second, the most common neurological symptom that patients complain of is actually muscle aches. They get a lot of muscle pain. We call them myalgias. And there's some concern that this may occur either due to the triggering of the immune system. It's not uncommon for most viral infections to have some muscle ache, but rarely, in some cases, the muscles itself can get so affected such that they can get weak, and actually there can be release of muscle enzymes, and they can go ahead and actually damage the kidney itself. So one of the things that is important is patients complain of muscle aches is to actually give them a lot of fluids, and that helps wash the system out. Okay, so if there's any muscle damage, you can wash those proteins out of the kidney and just flush them out. And then, as I said, if due to the metabolic abnormalities, patients can develop what is called an encephalopathy. Okay, and that means that their ability to think, concentrate, or their ability to, they can get a little bit groggy or sometimes become a little bit delirious. So those kinds of symptoms can occur, but usually that occurs in severe cases of COVID, where the lung is fairly affected to a fair bit, and so are other organ systems. Okay. Then there are some very rare complications. One is stroke. And a stroke is, again, very rare in children. Adults have been reported to have strokes. And most often there's some underlying risk factor. That means they had hypertension or diabetes or some cardiac problems. And those are the ones that predispose patients to stroke. But there are young people reported with stroke who have had no other underlying risk factors. But again, that's not common. It's quite rare. And the virus does cause a hypercoagulable syndrome where the blood tends to clot easily. Okay. So, and if there is any risk factor, oftentimes patients with COVID will be put on some kind of a blood thinner of sorts to prevent any clots from forming. And very rarely the virus can actually go into the brain and cause an encephalitis or a meningitis. But those are, very few cases have been reported. That you have millions of people affected, and only a handful of cases of actual meningitis or encephalitis have been reported in the literature. That makes us think that there must be something genetically different about those individuals who get this kind of a presentation. So that's actually pretty rare, but yes, it can occur. And with some of the other coronaviruses, it only occurred in individuals who are very immune suppressed, so that the immune system really couldn't fight it off, and the virus tends to enter into the brain in that case. So that's what happens in the acute phase with the virus. Then, so we call them para-infectious manifestations. That means when the virus is still raging and doing its thing. Then there's something called a post-viral syndrome. That means now the acute viral phase is gone. Patients are recovering from that, and now they end up developing some other symptoms. Either some of them never went away, or they develop new set of symptoms. And so those things we call as post-viral syndromes. And most often, these are immune mediated. That means the immune system got so cranked up, it was necessary to control the virus. But the virus is gone and the immune system continues to be cranked up. This prolonged immune activation can cause, sometimes can attack parts of the nervous system. And other times it can cause manifestations just by the fact that it remains chronically activated. So rarely it's been reported that you can get an encephalitis in the brain. We call it acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, which is where the immune system starts attacking the brain itself. And so again, it's a rare manifestation, but sometimes it can occur. And sometimes you can get the peripheral nerves can get involved. So when the nerves get involved, there's a syndrome called Guillain-Barré syndrome. And that has been reported also with COVID-19, but it's not as common as you see with some of the other infections. For example, with Zika virus, we saw a lot of Guillain-Barré syndrome. We don't see the same degree of Guillain-Barré syndrome with COVID-19, but yes, there are at least 30, 40 cases been reported in the literature right now. And then lastly, is becoming apparent that there is a post-COVID syndrome that looks very much like chronic fatigue syndrome. So there are patients who are now complaining that 2-3 months have passed by, but yet they have some low-grade fever, their lymph nodes are enlarged, they feel very tired very easily, they have a feeling of malaise, and they have some that stand up very quickly, they feel faint. And so, and the degree to which that is involved is variable. Some have a lot of symptoms, some have fewer symptoms. And it's a little bit early to know, since most patients, at least in the United States, have had the infection at most 3 months or so. And so we need to wait a little while longer to know what the real long-term consequences are. But we're getting concerned enough from patients reporting these kinds of symptoms that, at least at the National Institutes of Health, we are now trying to recruit these patients, trying to study them. And so we have now research protocols in place to try and understand the full spectrum of neurological manifestations of patients that seem to be lingering or occurring after the acute phase. Right? So I'll stop here and pass it back to Adam.
Great, thank you. So we only have a few minutes left. We have 5 questions. I don't know if we're going to get to all of them, but we'll start with by asking, so this question is for Dr. Campbell. Can you say more about how children will eventually be included in the testing, and whether or not there may be some clues that may come from studies for adults who have a lot of risk factors for complications, whether that may inform the studies that will be done in children who have a lot of medical issues.
Yeah, so right now the plan is that once those larger studies in adults get underway and we have more evidence that the vaccines are safe and we know what the right dose is, et cetera, that we would then start what we call phase 2 studies in children. And typically what we do in kids is what we call age de-escalation. So we start with older, like teenagers, then school-age kids, and then keep moving down because we think it's likely like a teenager will be more similar in terms of their safety and immunologic response. And then, you know, sometimes we have to adjust the dose for kids. So we have to like move, you know, as quickly as possible, but at the same time, be really careful about moving through. And those are usually healthy or relatively healthy children to start with. That gives us an idea in healthy kids, like what is the side effect profile? So if there are a lot of fevers, then it might be something that people who, you know, a fever might trigger a seizure or a fever might trigger something else, they'd be, you know, more concerned about that platform being the one that they would use, or they might be able to prophylax against that. So we could test whether or not giving like Tylenol or ibuprofen could prevent those fevers and then potentially prevent things like seizures associated with those fevers. So we would start with that. It's unlikely we're going to do phase 3 studies in kids because the incidence, you know, the number of kids infected is so low that we'd have to do almost the entire US population to be able to show that it worked. So what we need to do is large enough numbers to show that it's safe and that it makes the same immune response that adults do when it's protective. So yeah, that's our general approach.
So thank you. So let me ask this question of, we'll start with Dr. Nath. How are we going to know whether or not that the vaccines will be safe for children if they've had bad reactions to other vaccines in the past and have a rare form of epilepsy? So is there going to be a sense of who should and who should not get the vaccine?
So, you know, Dr. Campbell can correct me. The thing is, the fear of vaccines oftentimes is misplaced, you know. So as human beings, we are constantly fighting infections every day, right? So you're being exposed to something or another and your immune system is handling it. And otherwise you'd be very immune suppressed. You'd get all kinds of opportunistic infections and that could be very devastating. So that means that, and what a vaccine is nothing else but giving you a concentrated form of that same portion of that infectious organism. Sometimes not even the entire organism, it's just a part of it, right? And so yes, you're cranking up the immune system against it, but it's a single dose. So unless you're giving a live attenuated virus, which I don't think there's an intention of doing that, so you're giving a single dose. So I think that these things should be very safe. There should be very little concern about these kinds of side effects. And through the safety studies that are being done, there should be great reassurance that these things can be administered safely.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, Adam, that, you know, I think it will be important as we go down this path for families of children who have, you know, both epilepsy and other problems to be watching what the studies show, and then to work with your neurologist, your epileptologist, your pediatrician on what's the right approach. Because I think Gabby brought up another kind of potential approach is if there's concern, like let's say we find these vaccines, they work really well, but they're really reactogenic. And some people, meaning like they have a lot of side effects, like a lot of fever. Some people may say, I'm not willing to put up with the risk for my child to have that high fever because they're fragile, but I'm gonna do cocooning. Like that's what we call cocooning, what Gabby was describing before. We're like, everyone that has contact with that child gets vaccinated because they're not, even if they get a fever, it's not gonna bother them. And that gives some amount of herd or protection to the child, because if they're only exposed to those family members primarily, then they have low risk. So I think we just don't know yet. You know, for we will, if we get this down and licensed in children, it will be generally safe. But it's not easy always to say that for every child with every medical problem, that every vaccine platform is going to be completely safe. And I think we're going to have to make those decisions.
Dr. Campbell, I mean, wouldn't you agree that if fever is your concern, you can prophylax for fever, right?
Yeah, and we're going to need to study that. And we're doing that for other things right now. For some vaccines that have some fever but are really well protective, then we say, okay, let's give Tylenol and see whether or not that can reduce the fever. And if that's all it takes, then if it was my child, I would definitely say, if fever is the only concern, then the fever is going to trigger a seizure, then let's just prophylax against fever. It's a simple thing. If there's something else, then, you know, we need to know that. But I think it's unlikely. We're not going to move vaccines forward in children in general. It takes a high bar, you know, like, because we're talking about a whole population, you know, 4 million kids born a year. We have to have a very high bar for safety, and we're going to be very careful. That's why we're going through this process of figuring out, like, what are all the appropriate things? How long do we need to follow children? You know, like, what do we need to watch carefully to make sure that they're safe? And all of those things are done for every vaccine, but for this one, since it's brand new, we're watching it obviously really closely.
So let me follow up on that point. Is there any of the strategies that you've outlined so far, and that slide you had about the current vaccine strategies, is there anything, are any of them more likely to induce fevers than others? This is another question that we were asked.
We don't know yet. I mean, we won't know until we have further data. I can tell you for the Moderna, their first trial, they had 3 different dose levels. At the highest dose, yes, more fever. They dropped that dose. When you get down to the 2 other doses, no. But we don't know yet. But that's in low numbers of people. You know, if you have 100 people and you give them a vaccine and you find that 1 or 2 of them have a fever, then, you know, it's low rate, but you just don't know until you get to larger numbers. So once we have these larger studies done, then we'll know for sure, at least in adults. Some children get fever more commonly after vaccines than adults do. But again, it's going to be a thing to weigh. I mean, if you're a family that your child has frequent seizures and you're trying to weigh, okay, I'm going to get, let's say, you know, you're going to get complete protection against COVID-19, but it means having potentially, not necessarily, but potentially some additional seizures in a brief period of time, you may say that's worth it to you. I mean, it depends on you and your family and your doctor. Other people may say, no, like that sort of thing might tip my son or daughter over the edge and it's not worth it. And I'm gonna, you know, I think it's difficult to make those decisions for individual children if you're in the, you know, like in the fragile stage. But I think these vaccines will not be licensed unless they're considered generally safe for the entire population.
So,
so Adam, maybe you may want to take it further to say, let's say there is a concern that that the vaccine could cause a breakthrough seizure. Would you prophylax with a rescue medication?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. That sort of gets to one of the other questions that that we were asked about, why I said I've become more conservative. I think the issue is that if we can prevent someone from having to actually come into the hospital, what I've done is so this is not across the board, it's an individual kind of a thing. If someone we know is going to be very, very susceptible, their seizure control is very fragile, then I may say to the family, you know, usually we say wait 3 minutes into a seizure before we actually give the rescue medicine. I may say, let's back that off to 2 minutes if you really have a sense. You know, a lot of families are, I mean, you know, they're living with this. And so they sometimes have a really good sense of when a seizure, if it's going to go for 2 minutes, they know it's going to go for, you know, 2 hours. Whereas other families know it's going to stop at exactly 5 minutes. And that, you know, that's a very individual kind of a thing. So with some of my families, when I say I'm more conservative, for the children whose seizure control is more tenuous, where they're a little more twitchy, I've backed off the time, meaning I've recommended rescue medicines a little sooner than others. As far as giving someone a seizure rescue medicine prior to the vaccine, one of the problems is we don't really know when they're going to have that reaction. It may be that they're going to have that reaction within a few hours with the fever. They may have the reaction a couple of days later. And so when we look at other types of seizures like febrile seizures and using prophylaxis for that, it's a really, really tricky proposition. And so there's a study that was published, it's probably about 20, 30 years ago now, looking at giving children diazepam, Valium, around the clock when they had febrile seizures. And although it was successful, strictly speaking, they had a pretty big dropout rate because of all the side effects of the medication. The kids got, pretty dopey. So I think, again, it's if the reaction to the vaccine is going to be pretty predictable, then I'd be willing to have that kind of a conversation with the family. But what I don't want to do is cause more, everything is about risk and benefit, right? Yeah. And so what I don't want to do is cause more trouble than not. So I think it would be a very, very individualized kind of a situation. I would say that I would if families do have a concern, then I think they really should bring it up for discussion with their neurologist and with their pediatrician. I think it's definitely worth having the conversation and everyone laying their cards on the table. I don't think that it's not a good time to be quiet. I think it's a time to speak up and ask and engage in the discussion. And sometimes it's a matter of the physician having a better understanding of the family's concern. And sometimes it's a matter of the family learning something about, vaccine reactions. And again, the families know their children the best. And so we have to, I think we have to pay a lot of attention to that. So our last question was, will families with in this population, the children with the developmental epilepsies and other high-risk populations get early access to a vaccine? So I guess my question would be for the panelists, for our two panelists, is there going to be, if families do want to get into a trial early, how would they do that? And who would be the best candidates for that sort of an early look?
I think in terms of the trials, it's not likely that they would enroll children with major medical comorbidities to start, because usually we start with kids who don't have any problems and then eventually get to that, to kids who do have any medical issues. But in terms of access, once the vaccine is available, I mean, the way it works is, of course, the FDA will license the vaccine based on its record. And then there are various bodies in the United States that make recommendations on who to target. So if vaccine is available for everyone, then you don't need to target, you can just let everyone get it. If there's limited amount of vaccine, then you want to pick those who are at highest risk. And so those bodies would be people like the ACIP, which is the group at the CDC that makes vaccine recommendations for the US, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the group I work with, we make recommendations on vaccines, and others. So it's a different thing versus like the vaccine is available and licensed versus like who should be getting the vaccine. And right now, even kids with epilepsy, underlying neurologic problems, they may be at slightly higher risk, but they're not at very high risk compared to, for example, elderly people with any comorbidities or anyone who's an adult who has a medical problem. So if there's really limited vaccine, it will probably go to them first, no kids. And then once there's more and more vaccine, then it would be available probably for all children after you have a discussion with your doctor.
So under would there be any circumstances in which you might consider doing a safety study of the vaccine in patients with epilepsy?
Yeah, I mean, those typically don't occur pre-licensure. They can occur pre-licensure, but I think, let's say there was a disease that was known to be highly, morbid, like caused a lot of problems in children with epilepsy, then we would target, just like we do for like premature children would be targeted for things where they have high risk for a disease, or children who have immune deficiency of various types. There's certain vaccines that are very important for them, so they get targeted for. But if children with epilepsy or with other medical problems are not known to be at very high risk for this particular disease, then they tend not to be studied before the vaccine is licensed, but post-licensure.
But post-licensing, you could consider that.
Oh yeah, and they're often, and sometimes the FDA requires that. They say, we'll give you licensure, but after licensure, now that you can market it to the general population, we want you to study it in these following people, like pregnant women, or like people with medical problems, or whoever else had not been studied before it was licensed.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. Any other final comments, Dr. Nath?
No, I think you've covered a lot of ground. Maybe we should give a chance to Jennifer and to ask any questions that you might have or things that we didn't cover.
My mind is where, and I was talking kind of in the bio, we've chosen to do the outside stuff, not the inside stuff. We are about 2 months away from school starting. And so when we talk about considerations for the vaccine going to the elderly prior to our kids who are going back to school, because mine do attend public school, is there anything that we need to keep in mind as we send our kids? My district came out with guidance just Monday. Today's Wednesday, right? I've lost track in this COVID world. I don't know what day it is or what time it is. I have no idea. But, recommending masks for 10 and up and all of that. And I'm ordering masks for my 7-year-old daughter and hoping that she'll leave it alone and not touch it, and that her para will help keep her focused. But aside from that, are we wise to send our kids back to school and take all the protective measures that we can? Or is that something that we need to be more concerned with as the parent of a child with a medical condition that can land her into status epilepticus for hours where she's not breathing and not responding? And so it's kind of one of those things. She loves school, she loves her friends, so you weigh how miserable is she going to be here versus do we risk it? And so
yeah, I mean, so the American Academy of Pediatrics is currently developing, it has some guidance right now, but it's going down more granular into their guidance about return to school. And I've been a little bit a part of that from the infectious disease side. The epidemiology has been kind of interesting for kids in that almost all children that have been infected in their homes. And so the thought from the AAP right now, although we're working through the guidance, is keeping children at home may have more risk to them than putting them back in school. Not only infectious risk, but there's been lots of reports, and just it's kind of intuitive. There's lots of other risks by children not being allowed to go back to school. All the issues of socialization and learning and food for
abuse.
Poor children, for food. Yes, exactly. Abuse, all of those things. So when you weigh them, it's probably beneficial for children to be in school because they get very rare. Do they get sick from this? Even kids with comorbidities, rare for them to get. I mean, we see kids with all sorts of really severe diseases. Almost none of them in our clinic have gotten COVID and wound up in our critical care unit. Whereas when they get influenza, they get really sick. And when they get other things, they get really sick. I'm talking about like leukemics and transplants and all of that. So I think probably what's going to come down as a recommendation is, yes, put those sort of physical barriers and things we're doing, behavioral things in place, but that school is better. It's better for us to have kids back in school than at home.
That's so strange that they're doing so much better versus the flu and all of that, but it's relieving at the same time.
It is.
Yeah. I wonder if some of that has to do with the fact that our families are really intensely sheltering in place too. This is something that we live day in, day out, every week, every month of the year.
Yeah.
Is, avoiding infection. So this is kind of our, this is how we live, right?
But it's even true among people who that's not the case, where they're kind of laissez-faire about it. It just, that so far we've just not seen that schools or children being with children in other instances, like close contact between children, has led to infection. Plus, even in homes, it looks like the epidemiology is mostly children are getting infected from the adults in the home, not the other way around, like where for flu and regular colds, kids are like the drivers of the epidemic. It looks like in this instance, it's the other way around. Adults are the drivers of the infection.
But is there concern that the kids will give it to the teachers and then they spread it that way?
Yeah, I mean, there's asymptomatic spread. Kids are sometimes asymptomatic and they could spread. And yeah, that is a
mildly
possibility. And I think there are teachers, especially teachers who have high-risk conditions, who are worried about being back in schools.
Very.
Yeah.
I think with good hand washing and with good masking, and they have various ways that people are trying to do, types of physical distancing. I think all of those together will mitigate the risk. It's not going to get rid of the risk completely, but it should mitigate the risk.
And some teachers might be even retiring early, so we'll see.
I know of some who have.
We've had that happen. Yeah, our grade school's already retired a bunch of people, so it's, yeah. Any other final closing thoughts, Dr. Campbell?
My only closing thought is thank you so much to this group. I mean, it's just so great to have people who are so involved and so, willing to listen to dorks and geeks like me to give you the information about vaccines. I think what I said to Gabby was an educated consumer is our best customer, and you guys being like knowledgeable about this, not only helping your own families, but helping the other families with children who have these sorts of conditions. It's so important to us, and I'm just so appreciative that you all are there. So yeah, just thanks for inviting me. Great.
Jennifer, any other thoughts, closing thoughts?
I'm just thankful y'all took the time to do this. Take it back to my group, and I know I have a bunch of parents who are going to have a lot of questions, and they're going to watch once it gets uploaded. We had some log on, and then on our group Facebook, they said had to get off because kids, so they're going to be watching the recording. So I'm appreciative for all of you. Thank you. Life happens. Gabby, thanks for the invitation. It's back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. We're so grateful that all of you took time. We know that you're all very busy right now. This is it's really an intense time for you all. So we're grateful that you were here with us and gave us your time and your expertise. And, I think for a lot of us cocooning, the people who've got kids who are really susceptible to respiratory infections. And I think a lot of us are probably going to continue to shelter in place and cocoon when a vaccine does come out. And I think I also just want to mention, someone who we work closely with, who's a pediatric neurologist in Australia. She mentioned that it's important to really not be scared of vaccines. So I think we want to share a balanced, thinking around this. Vaccines have saved millions and millions of lives, and she mentioned that movie Calling the Shots, which follows families navigating concerns around vaccines and really looks at the scientific evidence around them. And I think that's what we want to follow, is scientific evidence to make sure that we keep our kids and our families safe. And so, yeah, I think, as we said in the beginning and throughout, really everybody should be looking at speaking with your children's providers, to really think about an individualized plan for this. And, we touched on rescue meds. Deep Connections has been partnering with LGS Foundation on a rescue med series for those with DEEs. We had our first webinar last week. We'll have another one with a clinician who'll talk a bit about, do a deeper dive in the different kinds of rescue meds and what they're used for and how and when. And then we'll hear from families in part 3. And then part 4, this is, came to mind for me, was looking at developing seizure action plans. And frankly, this is a great time to update your seizure action plans and have a caveat for if COVID-19 comes into your home, what do you do? and think about those things. We also have a webinar at the end of July on autonomic dysfunction 101, which is, I think will be important for a lot of families, because autonomic dysfunction can disguise itself as lots of things, you know, and so I think it'll be really revealing for families to listen to that and see, you know, maybe this is something that, you know, could apply to my child, and how it might be something that is treatable for your kid, when we know we have a lot of things in our lives that are not treatable. So thank you again to our panelists. You guys are incredible. Thank you for all the work you're doing. And thank you to Jennifer for sharing your thoughts on this. I think there's a lot of different perspectives, but we're really thrilled that we could bring this panel together to talk a little bit more about this. This is on all of our minds. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, Adam.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.